So welcome back to another edition of Facilitating Software Architecture and Design. That's what I've decided to call it this week. The usual people are here again. So it's me, Andrew Harmalo, and I'm joined by my usual co-conspirators, Kenny and Andrea. And today we've got Laïla with us, who is going to quickly introduce herself, I think, and then share some stories with us around about the topic of facilitating and collaborating on software architecture and design. Take it away, Laïla.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. So yes, my name's Laïla. I'm a software architect and engineer. I work for a company called Particular Software where we build in-service bus. So I'm basically very active in the messaging space. That's also been my specialty for, I don't even know how long anymore, a while, over a decade at this point. I've been in the software engineering industry for probably 2 decades at this point. Maybe I should stop sharing now, but no, it's been a fun ride. I've been active mostly in the .NET ecosystem. And I talk at conferences now and then to share a little bit of knowledge and also run some workshops on event-driven architectures and things like that. So that's me.
And do you want to share one of the idea behind the podcast? I think Kenny explained it right. Is like we share stories about when things got a bit complicated, and then we ask you some hopefully interesting questions. But have you got any stories that you wanted to particularly share with us, Leigh?
Right. So I was reflecting about this a little bit and thinking about, okay, which story could I tell? And I did reflect back on something that happened, but as I was thinking about it, it definitely wasn't a single incident like that. I think it's a sort of a pattern that has been happening year over year in many different environments, in many different teams. But the whole idea is basically regarding when you get a lot of people in the room, especially when there's a lot of smart people in the room, and we have to make a decision, either it's a design decision or an architectural decision, it doesn't even matter. There's a tendency to immediately sort of start comparing possible solutions against each other. And that can, in my opinion, cause a lot of friction because then it becomes very quickly my opinion versus that of a coworker versus that of another coworker. And then I've also seen that, people tend to become very protective of their own ideas. And then it becomes this sort of back and forth when I don't really think that's a productive way to think about the possible ways forward and how to go about that. So as part of working at Particular, actually, we have a completely different way of going about these things. And it has, because we basically have a different process to go about decision making, but that has influenced how I think, even if it's, standing on your feet type of a discussion, and also how I facilitate these types of meetings. And it's still not easy, but I feel like it has given a lot of positive steps forward. So that's
super. Could you maybe explain a little bit, describe the approach? Because I definitely understand and relate to kind of everyone rapidly. Andrea sees this all the time. That's very recognizable, right? The one where everyone picks a spot and then just fights against everyone else from their spot. But right. Do you want to maybe describe a little bit about how the alternative or an alternative could work? Right. That's super interesting.
So actually the thought process or the basis for my thought process comes actually from our RFC process. So the whole idea is that when we make bigger decisions that are more impactful, we write an RFC for it. And the whole idea is that we present multiple alternatives. And for each alternatives, we will list what are the assumptions that we made in this specific scenario, what are the risks involved for this specific scenario, and also before we get into alternatives, describe what is a problem that we're trying to solve and for whom are we solving this problem? So which stakeholder need are we addressing by solving this problem? Which I think gets rid of a lot of friction to begin with, because most of the time there seems to be a lot of misalignment around the problem that we're trying to solve to begin with. So figuring that part out is usually really helpful, and the earlier we can get to that, the better. But when it comes to sort of having these discussions around, alternatives, it's more, I think, putting yourselves in a position that there is no right or wrong proposal. And I think specifically, it's important to not start comparing prematurely.
Yeah, I think I always say when you get to good and bad, then your first step towards a conflict brews, right? Because you're saying something is bad and something is wrong. I sometimes try to specifically come up with bad examples, or probably examples that have high risk, just to find out what it is that we do want. But I'm always interested to see how people react to that. Very, very resistant, right? Do you see that sometimes happening still, right? Because we can make it rational and on paper, but as soon as someone already has like this thing in their mind, like, no, this is the only way to do it.
Yes.
How would you deal with fact? How would you get them to unlock and see the other possibilities in that way?
Yeah, that's a good question. So first of all, I sometimes feel that too. Like if someone brings up an alternative, I'm like, oh no, that's a horrible idea. But one of the things I've learned is when I get that feeling of this is a horrible idea, is I think my younger innocent self would have just said it, that's a horrible idea. And now I think like, okay, wait, why do I think that this is a horrible idea? Because sometimes it almost feels like this gut reaction, right? It's a horrible idea. And I always try to think about, okay, what assumptions may this person be making that are not being clarified, that may be false? Or what risks do I see in this solution? And then I think that if you just shift your mindset from this is a horrible idea to, okay, what are the hidden assumptions here, or what are the risks? Then I think you're having a much more constructive conversation to begin with, because it's not, well, this is a horrible idea, which can feel like almost like a personal attack to the other person. So it gets you immediately out of the conflict mode. So it becomes a conversation about, I can see that idea. Could it be that you're making this or that assumption? And then you start to have a completely different conversation. But Kenny, there was another part to your question too, is like if someone has this type of a resistance, like how would I react to that? And I think part of it I've already answered is by acknowledging, that every idea has a place, and to rather rephrase that as to, okay, and ask that person, why are you feeling so resistant to this idea? Are you seeing some assumptions that are being made that you think are false? Do you see any risks that we haven't thought of yet or that need to be surfaced? And I think that immediately de-escalates, because it takes it away from you have a horrible idea to, okay, there are some real gaps in this proposal that we need to address. And I think always bringing it back to what is it that we're having a disagreement about? That is, about the idea, about the implementation, about a solution, instead of having a disagreement with another person, immediately de-escalates the situation, in my opinion.
Nice. Yeah. So to follow up, so something that's in my mind a lot, because you work a lot with message-driven systems, and usually I'm with two teams or with several teams, and they need to communicate with each other, and that can be like, okay, here are my events, good luck, or like, no, but I'm a consumer and I just want one event, so like a summary event, for instance, right? And there's this whole power play, and there's not even a right or wrong decision, because you could use a summary event, or you can just say, just give me all your events. And so how do you deal with these? I can imagine with your expertise that you get into a lot of these conversation, right? And it's two teams against one another by default, because one, like, you build it, and the other team is like, no, here's just my event. So
Yes.
You probably face this situation. So that's question one. And what then, right? Because there's no right or wrong there.
Right.
Well, it's how I see it.
So I always see these types of collaborations as a game of give and take. So what I will try to do is, for example, let's say we are in this case of a sort of event that is much more granular versus an event that is a summary event, and that makes it a bit more easier. For me, that's already possibly, in some cases, kind of a smell in terms of service boundaries. So I will try to have that conversation that way and try to find that incentive for the other team. Because of course, it's totally understandable, right? Every team has their own deadlines. They have their own backlog. So I understand when there's resistance from another team to do something that is, for the benefit of another team, because it's basically cutting into their own, let's say, time budget, so to speak. So I think, first of all, acknowledging that and not seeing, again, something as a personal attack. It's more like, well, put yourself in that team's position. They probably have their own deadlines. They probably have their own backlog. And by just considering that, it's already de-escalates, because we can all sort of find ourselves in that situation, and we've all sort of been there before. So that creates a level of understanding. But another thing I will try to do is then to look at that and try to raise my concerns. So what are the concerns that I have around, for example, consuming a more granular event? Is it that we're just going to have to handle many more events and I don't really care about consuming all of that? Or is it because there are concerns around some things that may, for example, introduce some type of coupling? For example, let's say, as an example I use a lot, let's say that you have some credit card service, right? And it's emitting all of these transactions that are happening on the service. But there's another service that just wants to know, I want to know at the end of the month how much was spent on the credit card, right? And then you could have this team saying, yeah, but you already have access to all of these events on the card. So why do I need to create the summary event for you? Well, then you could say, well, the problem is that now I have to understand what a period means to you. And that's something that is actually a concern of your service. And I don't want to duplicate that type of logic into my service, because that would create coupling between us. And I'm sure you wouldn't want me to copy that type of logic, because then if it changes, I would have to change it too. And then we become tightly coupled to each other. And then we get other types of messes, right? So it's also about having those types of conversations of, it might take a little bit more work now, but it's going to protect your independence or your autonomy in the longer term. So I always try to find these types of angles.
So I think that's super interesting, Laïla, because I think sometimes teams they're not aware of that, right? They kind of they're not aware, like somebody else worries about the boundaries between them and the other team. And typically someone else also worries about how long it'll take another team to do the work versus how long it'll take you to do the work. And I think that's super interesting, because that's stuff that is usually someone else's problem, right? But in the cases that you've described, you're trying to bring that, at least make them aware of that, which I think is really interesting.
But if we're trying to aim towards autonomous teams, then considering your boundaries as part of your day-to-day needs to be something, an activity. And actually, this is where I was going to ask you, Laïla. Like, how do you help teams to, because you said, it could be a symptom of not greatly defined boundaries. And let's face it, that's probably happening all the time. And right, and sometimes you can't do anything about it. But sometimes there is some wiggle room because they realize that teams are moving slower because they are lacking the autonomy. And so when you do have to do boundary work, how does that work for you? Like, what kind of activities do you do? And also, how do you find it? Like, because you talked about, like, well, sometimes feelings give you, like, not just the personal problems, which there definitely would be because you have the power play, but the technical side effects of those ones.
Right. Absolutely. So first, I want to just say that I was thinking exactly the same thing as what you said, is I think service boundaries shouldn't be a few people's problem. I think that's something that is owned by the entire team and all of the teams that are basically collaborating with each other. Because the more people understand those boundaries, I think the more likely it is that we surface those problems earlier. And otherwise, it becomes this thing that you don't care about. And then you would be less likely to push back to consuming a granular event, for example, and then creating this sort of couple. So I just wanted to add to that. But yeah, when it comes to sort of doing that service boundary work, I've always, and this is something that is not something I've learned due to sort of building event-driven systems, but I think it just comes from my own personal curiosity. I've always wanted to understand the business. I've always had a really hard time to actually write code if I don't understand what the purpose of that thing is. It's just something that for me did not compute. And honestly, I felt like especially in my junior years, as if I was doing something wrong because I felt unable to just, well, here are the requirements, Laïla, just build it. And I'm like, but but I have so many questions and I don't understand this. And how does that work? And why do we do this? And I felt like really annoying. And it took years for me to realize that that was a strength and not a weakness. But yeah, I think that's one of the parts, is that to continuously ask questions as to why are things connected to each other. There's a lot of work that goes into understanding these types of boundaries. I try to do that work early, but it's also a continuous job. It never really ends, right? Every time something changes, you almost have to re-question those things to make sure you didn't miss something earlier or if something changed. And this is where things get tricky, because especially if it takes you a lot of effort to define service boundaries, then people are like, we got them, we will never touch these again. And reality does not reflect that, right? It's just, that's not really how it works. One thing I tend to do is, first of all, if we can have these conversations that at least surface these maybe imperfections or full out wrong decisions in terms of our service boundaries, sometimes we can't immediately fix them because, again, multiple teams are involved, and it's also not easy because some data might need to be migrated and things like that. It can become quite complex. And sometimes the only thing we can do is work around it. But I think for me, it's always been really important to surface it, to document it, and to keep track of all of the friction that we encounter because the service boundaries are off. Because in many cases, what I found is that there may be an agreement within the team that service boundaries are off, but we're not getting the budget to make those changes, for example. And then collecting evidence of what type of friction those errors or in the service boundaries are causing us can basically act as better evidence to have the discussion of, okay, now we really need to prioritize that work because this bug or this discussion or this feature or this coupling has been causing us issues. And then that makes it much easier to sort of have that discussion. So yeah, I build evidence. That's one of the things I do.
So one thing I see, and I feel having myself as well, is perfectionism is the enemy of design and architecture, right? So we try to come with evidence and we try to come with reason, even though we have our own personal opinion, of course. Can you think of a moment in the past where you're like, this needs to be this way, but budget, teams, other people thought differently, so you went with another decision, and that's sort of like a loss for yourself? I feel it's a loss.
Yes.
How do you deal with that? Can you tell something about that? Because I think that's the most common thing that well, at least I deal with, right? Letting go.
Yes. Actually, I can think of two situations, to be honest. And one of them, I was actually working at a bank for which I worked for 5 years. And we basically built a system that replaced the mainframe, to say it in like a single sentence, right? So it's an entire banking system. And I remember that there was a piece of code that I could just look at it from a distance and I'm like, this is going to be trouble. But then, the rest of the team was like, but we already have the tests and this is already done. And I'm like, I can really see trouble. And they were like, yeah, but we have to move on. And I was like, okay, so move on. And this is an example of where I kept evidence. So every time a bug came in that was related to that, it was just being fixed. Oh, we're going to fix this scenario. And now we're going to fix that scenario. Now we're going to fix that scenario. And I just kept track of every time a bug came in. And I just didn't intermingle. I was like, okay, it's fixed, fine. And at some point, I think we were at, I don't know, like almost 10-ish bugs. I just raised it and I said, okay, look, I don't want to be like, and I tried to, in those cases, not use the I told you so card, because that just doesn't really help in terms of your relationships. But just to kind of raise it as, look, I thought we would have some problems there. And I've been seeing that we are seeing a lot of bugs come into this sort of area. And I've collected them. I really think we need to rethink this thing and see how we can adjust it. And I think by presenting it that way, it enabled me to convince the rest of the team to actually make room for that. And that's when we actually refactored the whole thing. And from there, it was mostly bug-free. So that was one scenario, Kenny, but actually I also have a completely different scenario where I was like, yeah, this is wrong. I'm sure this is wrong. And I had to let it go, but internally hadn't really let it go. And it was like something that was frustrating me. So I was kind of doing the same thing as, okay, let me gather evidence around this. And after a while, I saw there is no evidence, which I think is an equally good exercise because it was proof to myself that I was wrong, which is fine. But basically a reminder that, even when we feel very strongly or think very strongly about something, it's a kind of like this humbling exercise of you're not always right, which I think is necessary for everyone.
I like that, especially because as architects, you do a lot based on heuristics, right? On things that worked in the past.
Mhm.
So I like the evidence. I like that as a heuristic. So also be evidence towards the wrongness, because sometimes you need to take a decision in the moment based on like gut feeling, maybe, which we call
Mhm.
heuristics. But it's great that keeping evidence and see if you're right or wrong. I like that. Yeah.
Yeah, it's actually a technique I use in many different areas. Even let's say processes that you have in an organization that you believe has friction, right? Sometimes it can be like, very frustrating and you want to go and change it immediately and you can because it's someone else's job. Then sometimes it's also the distance that it gives you, right? Because that's actually, I would say, my technique of letting go. It's like, I don't feel like I'm entirely letting go because I'm keeping track, but it does give me a lot of distance. And after a while, it gives me sort of evidence either for or against myself, but that gives me a good insight into what did I get wrong or what could have gone differently here.
I just kind of think I love the two examples that are superimposed. And I think it takes wisdom to acknowledge and kind of have the level of introspection to first build those processes for yourself. And also then to acknowledge other people's processes, but also to
Mhm.
just go like, okay, this works. And I might not like it, which is different from it doesn't work. And in fact, it
Right.
might work better than I could have done because I'm not having that problem. So,
Yes, exactly. Yeah. I think it's that's for me a good way to learn, because sometimes we can have resistance about something, but if after a while, and I think that's where the distance is really essential, because we always say that people cannot not be emotional, right? We're emotional beings. So sometimes we'll get upset about something, we feel strongly, we're motivated, we're passionate, whatever. And that can sometimes lead to a situation in which we push too hard, right? So by having that distance and waiting and seeing how things are gonna evolve, we could also sort of learn of, yeah, like you said, Andrea, I got it totally wrong. And what can I learn from this to improve myself? And I think that has been definitely an eye opener, a humbling one sometimes, which is also a good thing, right? It's like,
But I
nothing
think
like
to make,
the slapping you right in your face. Yeah.
yes.
but I think that's the tension, right? I think most architects or most people are like, we need to make a rational trade-off process. Yes, and there's emotions and past feelings, and we're dealing with complexity, so we actually don't know what's going to happen and what's the right decision now. Because as my dear friend Heen says, if we're clairvoyant, it would all be very much easy architecture. We don't need to do it. But we're not clairvoyant, unfortunately. So there's this lot of emotions, past things happening, and they're there. And what I like about what you're saying is at least have a process to continuously recheck yourself against what's happening now. And yeah, don't step into the sunk cost fallacy. And I think if teams actually do that by default as a team, we would be making very better decisions or architecture that adapt, I guess.
Right. So talking about processes, to kind of close the loop on this, I actually have a process for myself of having like quarterly retrospectives. And I have these notes of things like these that I've been keeping track of. So let's say that in the meantime, I use it as a data point collection type of thing. I don't spend brain cycles thinking about it. I just note it down. And then every 6 weeks, 12 weeks, whatever works best for you, I just go through the list. And every time there's something I can just throw off the list, like in the sense of, either I don't feel as strongly about this anymore. I changed my mind over time. Or it could be like, I thought there was a problem here. Doesn't look like there is a problem here. And then it allows me to move on. But by circling back to it, you're basically kind of also resolving your personal feelings around it and really letting go. So yeah, that's my advice to anyone who's listening, to have some kind of a process like that.
That's beautiful. Also, it allows you to learn where were you wrong. So it's like not only you can let it go and go like, actually, that was probably a false positive or the opposite, but you are able to kind of, sometimes you might be able to go like, actually, I was looking for this type of bugs and X, Y, Z, whatever it is. And then that didn't happen, or it happened in a different way, but you're like, what is the thing? And then you can close it. So it's like, not only can you drop it, but also you can activate the learning and kind of have notes about it. It's great. Because you could go back to stuff that you did ages in. Very nice.
Yes.
I love it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I call them personal retrospectives. I mean, we tend to do retrospectives in group, but I find them very, very helpful on a personal level as well. Like, what was I frustrated about 6 months ago? And then you look back to it and you're like, is that what I was frustrated about? Really? So things like that can really, it lightens things up and it allows closure of things that otherwise, the last thing you remember about something is that frustration. And this kind of mitigates that. It provides this sort of check-in point with yourself of like, oh, it was actually not that bad or something like that.
Yeah, and we all have that. And if people think, I don't have that, think the last time that you're hungry, right? And you eat maybe a little bit too much. And then in retrospect, you're like, nah, I shouldn't have done that. I shouldn't have stuffed my face with that. And I guess that's with certain decisions as well, being very frustrated about a decision. But later on, you're like, it was just an emotion or a certain other thing. So
actually, I find that in architecture, we see this all the time. Because like you said, a lot of architects sometimes also make decisions based on gut or heuristics, like you said. But those heuristics are usually like emotional. So if something didn't work in an environment, it doesn't mean that it won't work in this environment. So again, like all of the context is completely different. And by doing this sort of retrospective, you can sort of think about, okay, why didn't this work in a specific scenario? And that then allows you to sort of not completely rule it out in the future in different environments.
Yeah, it's the same like if I go to my school here, I take the bus, but I shouldn't do that in many other countries when I was a child. Context changes a lot. So
yes.
Thanks for your stories and thanks for being on the show.
Thank you for having me.
People listening, and for people listening, like, subscribe. I need to say this, spread the word. Hopefully this was very helpful to you. And a good thing to know, we'll be all at DDD Europe. So talk to us about these stories. Maybe you have your own stories we would like to know. So see you soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.